James never imagined that the land he had worked 15 years to purchase would become the center of a legal battle. To him, the 3 acres of lush greenery, the winding creek, and the towering oak trees weren't just property. They were the reward of a lifetime of hard work. He had chosen Willow Creek Estates for its tranquility, for the privacy promised by the maps that showed his land secluded from the main roads of the neighborhood. But one morning, that peace was shattered. From his kitchen window, James saw men in reflective vests surveying his property. White boundary lines had appeared in the grass near the creek. A sinking feeling twisted in his gut. Rushing outside, his anger flared as he watched them marking off sections of land he owned. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" James called out, his voice strained with forced composure. One of the workers, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, glanced at him before replying calmly but firmly. "Just following orders, sir. The HOA approved this road project last month." James froze. "What road? I never received any notice about this." The worker gestured toward the far end of the property, where Eleanor Brooks, the HOA president, stood overseeing the workers. Dressed in a bold red blazer, her pearl necklace gleaming, clipboard in hand, Eleanor radiated authority. James clenched his fists, his deed still in his coat pocket, and strode toward her. "Eleanor, there must be some mistake," he said, fighting to keep his temper in check. "You can't build anything on my land without my permission." Eleanor barely glanced at him, her expression unbothered. She offered a saccharine smile. "Oh, James," she said, her voice light but edged with steel. "The board unanimously approved this project. This road will connect the neighborhood to the park, increasing our property values. The notice was posted in the HOA newsletter. Didn't you read it?" James felt his blood boil. "I never received any notice, but more importantly, this is my land. You can't just make decisions like this without my consent or the proper permits." Eleanor chuckled, waving a dismissive hand as if he was overreacting. "James, don't make a fuss. It's just a small road for the common good. You shouldn't be so selfish." That remark sent James over the edge. Not only was she blatantly encroaching on his land, but she was also painting him as the villain, like he was the only one standing in the way of this so-called progress. James turned his head, scanning the crowd of neighbors watching the exchange. Some avoided his gaze, while others whispered among themselves. The HOA had manipulated the community, turning him into the obstacle to the neighborhood's development. But James wasn't about to back down. He knew he had to fight for his legal rights. This was only the beginning of an uphill battle. He couldn't let Eleanor Brooks and the HOA unlawfully construct a road on his property. As soon as he got home, he called Emily, a real estate attorney he had known for years. After listening to his account, she asked him to send over all his property ownership documents for review. A few hours later, she called back, her voice firm. "James, they have no legal right to build on your land without your consent. This is a clear case of unlawful property encroachment." Emily immediately drafted a cease and desist letter and sent it directly to the HOA. But James didn't stop there. He also filed a formal complaint with the County Planning and Building Office, reporting that the HOA had failed to obtain the necessary permits for the project. The next morning, James arrived at the construction site with the official cease and desist letter from his attorney. But the sight before him made his stomach drop. The work hadn't stopped. The construction crew was still there, digging deeper into the land. Excavators had carved out more of the soil. Concrete posts had been installed along the path, and workers continued measuring and marking the area. James clenched the letter in his hand, struggling to keep his composure as he marched straight to the site supervisor. "I have a legal order to halt construction, effective immediately," James declared, holding the document up in front of them. The supervisor, a weary-looking middle-aged man, glanced at the paper and let out a tired sigh. "We're just following orders from the HOA. Eleanor Brooks assured us that all the paperwork was in order." James's fists tightened. "She claims that, but this is my land. I never signed any document approving this." The supervisor didn't argue. Instead, he simply turned away and continued overseeing the work. James felt a surge of anger rising inside him. They were outright ignoring a legal order. This wasn't just about property encroachment anymore. This was a blatant defiance of the law. But the worst was yet to come. That evening, when James returned home, he opened his mailbox and found a series of anonymous letters. Don't stand in the way of progress. Think about the community's best interest instead of your selfishness. We don't need troublemakers like you in this neighborhood. A chill ran down his spine. Someone had started a campaign against him, and it didn't stop with the letters. When James went to the local grocery store, he immediately sensed a shift in the way people treated him. The neighbors who once greeted him each morning now avoided his gaze. A mother pulled her child away when he walked down the aisle. At the community pool, conversations fell silent the moment he appeared. Families quietly packed up their belongings and left as if his presence alone was unwelcome. James realized that Eleanor Brooks hadn't just forced an illegal road onto his land. She had manipulated the entire community against him, turning him into the neighborhood's enemy. One morning, as James stepped outside, he froze in place. His mailbox had been spray-painted in bright red letters, "Selfish." They were trying to isolate him. The situation kept escalating. One morning, as James got into his car to drive to work, he found his tires slashed. The security cameras hadn't captured anything. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. Someone was sending a clear message. Either he backed down, or things would get worse. James called Emily, his voice firmer than ever. "They're trying to intimidate me." Emily sighed on the other end. "They're using isolation and intimidation tactics, James. Don't react the way they want you to. Gather evidence, stay calm, and keep pushing forward with the case." James nodded, knowing this battle had only just begun. The HOA thought they could pressure him into submission with community backlash. But they had picked the wrong person to challenge. They had made a huge mistake. Sitting in his living room, James flipped through the property documents Emily had sent him. The anger inside him hadn't faded. The HOA hadn't just trespassed on his land. They had blatantly ignored the cease and desist order. But what enraged him the most was Eleanor Brooks's smug confidence. She acted as if the law didn't apply to her, as if his property rights were just a minor inconvenience standing in the way of her plans. But one morning, as James carefully reviewed his property records again, he noticed something crucial. The map the HOA had been using to justify their project was outdated. To be certain, he hired a professional land surveyor to verify the actual boundaries of his property. When the results came in, James could hardly believe his eyes. The HOA wasn't just building illegally. They had encroached over 12 feet into his land without even realizing it. Clutching the survey documents, James marched straight to Eleanor's house. When she opened the door, that familiar look of self-assurance still lingered on her face. "I have the latest survey results," James said, his voice calm but firm. "Not only is the road being built illegally, but it's also encroaching 12 feet deeper into my land." Eleanor blinked, but quickly regained her composure. "This is just a difference in how the maps are interpreted," she said, her tone casual, as if he had pointed out a minor error. "The community needs this road, James. If you understood how this neighborhood operates, you'd know that sometimes we need to be more flexible with the numbers." James clenched his fists. "You're talking about property ownership as if it's something negotiable." "We voted, James," Eleanor replied, a glint of challenge in her eyes. "The road will be completed. If you want to sue, go ahead. But let me warn you, HOA has the resources to drag this case out for years, and in the meantime, the road will stay." James turned away without another word. He knew Eleanor was counting on him not having the patience or the financial means to sustain a drawn-out legal battle. But what she didn't realize was that he had just discovered a far more powerful card to play. That night, James received a call from an unknown number. "Is this the homeowner protesting the road at Willow Creek Estates?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is James. Who's calling?" "Emily Richardson, County Environmental Inspector. I received your complaint, but I think there's something very important you should know." James frowned. "What is it?" "The stream on your property falls under the jurisdiction of the Natural Resources Management Agency. Any construction near it requires a special environmental permit, and I don't see any record of the HOA applying for one." James sat up straight, a mix of shock and excitement surging through him. "So, if they keep building without that permit, what happens?" Emily lowered her voice. "They could face massive fines and be legally forced to tear everything down." For the first time in weeks, James smiled. Eleanor Brooks thought she could bully him with legal loopholes and community pressure, but she hadn't anticipated that the very road the HOA was building would become their biggest vulnerability. The next morning, as James looked out his window, he saw the construction crew still at work. Concrete had been poured, and wooden stakes had been firmly driven into the ground. Eleanor stood nearby, clad in a striking red blazer, exuding confidence, certain she had already won. James picked up his phone and called Emily. "I need a meeting with the Environmental Resource Management Office." As soon as possible, he glanced back at the construction site taking shape on his land, knowing the battle was far from over. But this time, he held the most powerful card. Sitting on his porch, James watched as the road continued to take form on his property. The workers showed no signs of stopping, pouring concrete, driving stakes into the ground, and leveling the surface. Eleanor Brooks stood at the edge of the site, clipboard in hand, overseeing everything as if she had absolute control over the area. But she had no idea that in just a few days, everything was about to change. The next morning, as the rumble of excavators echoed from across the stream, James received a call from Emily Richardson, the county environmental inspector. She requested an on-site meeting to assess the extent of the violations. When she arrived, she studied the construction, took notes in her ledger, then turned to James with a serious expression. "This is worse than I expected," she said. "Not only is the HOA building illegally on your land, but they're also violating environmental protection regulations. This area falls under a designated conservation zone. Any construction here requires a special permit. If they don't have one, this project will be shut down immediately." James felt a surge of hope. "So they'll have to tear everything down?" Emily nodded. "Not just that. They could face major fines and be legally required to restore the area to its original condition." James knew this was the most devastating blow to Eleanor's plans. As the construction crew continued their work, James quietly installed additional security cameras around his property, recording every action the HOA was taking. He wasn't going to miss a single piece of evidence when this case inevitably went to court. In the days that followed, James noticed a subtle but significant shift in how the neighborhood residents treated him. At first, they had looked at him with hostility, branding him as the selfish homeowner, standing in the way of progress. But now, whispers had begun circulating. Some neighbors were questioning whether the HOA had overstepped its authority. One morning, as James stepped outside to check his mailbox, he saw Mr. Jenkins, an elderly neighbor, approaching him. "I don't want to interfere, but my wife told me I should ask," Mr. Jenkins said hesitantly. "Is it true that the HOA is actually breaking the law?" James nodded and pulled out his phone, showing him the email from Emily Richardson confirming the environmental violations. Mr. Jenkins stared at the screen, then let out a deep sigh. "We had no idea they were doing this without a permit. If that's the case, then Eleanor has gone too far." Word started to spread. Other residents began approaching James, asking similar questions. Doubts about Eleanor's claims in the HOA meeting started surfacing. When a group of parents learned that the road project could lead to environmental fines costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, they quickly organized a private meeting to discuss the issue. That evening, as James was tidying up his house, the doorbell rang. When he opened it, he found Eleanor Brooks standing on his porch. Her posture was stiff, her usual confidence still intact, but there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. "Can you put an end to this fight, James?" she asked, her tone less confrontational than before. "We both know you don't really want to go up against the HOA. If you're willing to cooperate, I'm sure the board will consider offering you fair compensation." James crossed his arms. "And what exactly do you mean by cooperate?" Eleanor exhaled sharply. "You could sign a land use agreement granting the HOA rights to the property in question. In return, we'd pay you a settlement. It's the best way to resolve this without making things uglier." James shook his head. "I don't care about money. I care about my legal rights. You and the HOA broke the law, and now things have escalated beyond your control." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Do you really think that once this road is finished, you'll still be able to stop it?" James smiled. "I don't have to stop it. I just have to wait for the authorities to step in." As Eleanor turned and walked away, James felt a shift in the battle. This was no longer a fight he was waging alone. The entire neighborhood was starting to question what the HOA had done, and with a full-scale government investigation underway, Eleanor was about to face consequences she had never anticipated. James sat in his living room, staring out the window at the road taking shape on his land. The workers continued their tasks, leveling the surface, installing drainage systems, reinforcing the concrete posts. Nearby, Eleanor Brooks stood with her eyes fixed on the project plans, barking orders as if everything was still going exactly as she had envisioned. But what she didn't know was that at this very moment, James held a piece of information that could change everything. The morning before, James had received a call from a man named Thomas Reynolds. His voice was deep, steady, and filled with confidence. "I've been following your situation," Thomas said. "Do you realize that the HOA just accidentally created an extremely valuable asset?" James frowned, uncertain of his meaning. "What do you mean?" Thomas chuckled. "I'm a real estate developer. For years, the city has been trying to connect its walking trails and parks. The road the HOA is building on your land happens to be the perfect missing link for that project. And most importantly, the legal owner of the land is the only one who has the right to sell or grant access to it." James sat up straight, his mind suddenly racing. "So you're saying—" "If you want," Thomas said, "you can negotiate with the city to sell them the rights to this land. From what I know, the city is willing to pay a lot of money to secure control over that route. The HOA has no legal authority to sell or make decisions about it because they built it illegally on your property." James hung up, his heart pounding. The HOA thought they had won, that there was nothing he could do but accept the road as an unavoidable reality. But they never expected that the very project they built without permission had turned his land into a strategic asset worth millions. The next day, James stepped outside, arms crossed, watching the workers continue their labor. But this time, he wasn't angry. He wasn't frustrated. He was smiling. When Eleanor Brooks arrived at the site and stepped out of her car, she immediately noticed the shift in his demeanor. "What's going on, James?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Oh, nothing," James replied with a shrug. "I'm just starting to appreciate this road." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, trying to decipher what he was up to. But neither she nor anyone in the HOA could have guessed that James was no longer fighting against the road. Instead, he was planning to turn it into a multi-million-dollar deal. In the following days, James contacted city officials to verify the information Thomas had provided. They quickly expressed interest in purchasing the land rights. A week later, he received an official offer, $7 million to transfer the road's usage rights to the city, making it an official part of the public transportation and pedestrian network. James reread the number, feeling victory within his grasp. The HOA had thought they could bully him, force him to accept their will, but now they were the ones losing control. And Eleanor Brooks, the woman who had once confidently declared that the road would be built no matter what James did, was about to face the reality that the HOA would never own it. Stepping onto his porch, James took a slow sip of coffee, watching as the concrete road neared completion. The workers continued their tasks, trucks hauling materials across his land, without anyone bothering to ask permission. Eleanor Brooks stood nearby, overseeing the progress with an air of authority. She had no idea that her time was almost up. James had everything he needed to shut this project down and put an end to the HOA's overreach. That morning, a convoy of county government vehicles rolled into the neighborhood. As the cars came to a stop, James spotted Emily Richardson, the environmental inspector, stepping out alongside a team of legal and technical experts. Without hesitation, they walked straight toward the construction site, offering no advance notice. From a distance, Eleanor noticed the commotion. Her smile was polite, but her eyes flickered with unease as she strode toward them. "Is there a problem?" she asked, trying to maintain her confidence. Emily didn't flinch. "We're conducting an official site inspection in response to a complaint regarding environmental violations." Eleanor let out a light chuckle, crossing her arms. "Oh, I'm sure there's nothing out of order. This is just a small community road meant to serve the residents." One of the specialists accompanying Emily knelt down, pressing a moisture gauge into the freshly poured concrete. He studied the reading, then exchanged a quick glance with Emily. Emily nodded before turning back to Eleanor, her gaze now sharper. Do you have an environmental permit for this construction? Emily asked. Eleanor blinked, but maintained her composure. We don't need a permit. This is simply an internal HOA project. Emily held up a stack of documents in front of Eleanor. Actually, you do need a permit. This area is part of a designated wetland conservation zone, and any project affecting the stream requires approval from the Environmental Protection Agency. We checked the records. There is no permit application from the HOA. Eleanor's face paled. She snatched the documents and flipped through them, but there was nothing she could say to refute it. Meanwhile, the team of specialists continued their inspection, taking photos, making notes, and collecting soil samples. The workers on site started realizing that something was seriously wrong. One by one, they began packing up their tools and quietly leaving. James stood on the sidelines, arms crossed, watching as Eleanor completely lost control of the situation. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure, but the panic in her eyes was unmistakable. We'll have to issue an immediate stop work order, Emily declared. If the HOA continues construction without a permit, they'll face fines of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Eleanor's icy demeanor finally cracked. She turned to the other HOA board members standing nearby, looking for support, but no one spoke. A few of them even took a step back, distancing themselves from her, as if afraid of being caught in the fallout. As soon as the inspection team left, Eleanor stormed over to James, her face tense with barely restrained fury. What did you do? She hissed. James raised an eyebrow. What did I do? I just protected my land, and it looks like the authorities agree with me. Eleanor clenched her fists. You're ruining everything we built. James let out a quiet chuckle. You did that to yourself. All I did was make sure the right people knew the truth. She didn't say another word. Instead, she spun on her heel and marched back to her car. As Eleanor drove away, James looked around and noticed a small group of neighbors gathering nearby. They whispered among themselves, their faces reflecting a mix of emotions. Some looked at him with admiration. Others seemed unsettled, perhaps realizing for the first time that the HOA wasn't as untouchable as they once thought. James walked back toward his house, the weight of victory settling over him. The HOA thought they controlled everything, but in the end, they couldn't outrun the law. Eleanor Brooks might not be ready to accept defeat just yet, but she was finally beginning to understand that this game was coming to an end. James sat at his kitchen table, unfolding the official letter from the HOA that had just arrived. The bolded threats seemed to leap off the page. The HOA accused him of obstructing community development and claimed that if he continued to cause trouble, they would countersue him for diminishing property values in the neighborhood. They even cited a so-called implied consent clause, arguing that since he hadn't physically stopped the workers, he had effectively approved the project. James let out a sharp laugh. If they thought a threatening letter would make him back down, they had severely underestimated him. Without hesitation, he snapped a photo of the letter and sent it to Emily. Within minutes, his phone rang. They're panicking, Emily said bluntly. This letter proves that they know they're in the wrong. There's no such thing as implied consent when it comes to property ownership. The law doesn't work that way. And we have all the evidence we need, the no trespassing, signs you put up, the cease and desist letter, and the video footage of Eleanor Brooks blatantly ignoring your warnings. James nodded, even though she couldn't see him. So, what's our next move? I'll draft a formal response, Emily said. We'll make it crystal clear that the HOA has no legal claim to your land, that they violated environmental laws, and that if they don't back down immediately, you'll be taking them to court. I'd bet anything they don't want that to happen. James agreed and hung up. But just as he set his phone down, the doorbell rang. When he opened the door, Eleanor Brooks stood at his front steps. This time, she was alone. No lawyers, no HOA board members. She didn't look as self-assured as she once had. James, she said, her voice carefully measured, I think we can negotiate. James folded his arms. Negotiate? She nodded. I understand that we may have been a bit hasty in moving forward with the project without discussing it with you first. She paused, then added, the HOA wants to avoid a lengthy legal battle. We're willing to offer reasonable compensation in exchange for the right to use the land. James narrowed his eyes. Reasonable compensation? Eleanor sighed, reached into her handbag, and pulled out a stack of documents. We're offering $25,000 for permanent land use rights to the road. It's a fair offer. James took the stack of documents, flipped through the pages quickly, then closed it without a second thought. You think I'd sell my land use rights for that? Eleanor maintained a calm expression, but James noticed the way her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. You can propose a more reasonable number, she said. James met her gaze head-on. I just received an offer from the city government. They're willing to buy the land use rights for $7 million. Eleanor blinked, and for the first time, James saw her confidence falter. $7 million? James nodded. And I'm considering something else, he continued, suing the HOA for trespassing and environmental violations. If I do that, you know as well as I do that the HOA could be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. A long silence stretched between them. Eleanor took a slow breath, trying to regain her composure. What do you want, James? She asked finally. James leaned forward slightly. I want the HOA to admit they were wrong. I want them to be held accountable, and I want to make sure that this never happens to anyone else in this neighborhood. Eleanor stood motionless, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't respond immediately, because she knew. This time, she wasn't in control, and James knew at last that the power had shifted. James sat in his living room, gazing out the window at the road the HOA had illegally built. Before, every time he saw the workers on his land, he felt anger, a sense of helplessness. But this time was different. Now he knew that Eleanor Brooks and the HOA had overplayed their hand, and they were about to face the consequences. That afternoon, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of his house. The door opened, and Thomas Reynolds, the real estate developer he had spoken to earlier, stepped out, a folder of documents in his hands. James walked outside to meet him, shaking his hand. I have the final offer from the city, Thomas said, his voice firm. $7,800,000. This is their final number. James nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision ahead. If he accepted, he wouldn't just end the battle with the HOA, he would win it outright. The city would purchase the land use rights, making the road an official part of the public transportation and pedestrian system. The HOA would be completely shut out of the deal. They wouldn't get a single cent. I'll sign, James said without hesitation. Thomas smiled. Good. We'll announce it at the HOA meeting tonight. That evening, James arrived at the community center where the HOA had called an emergency meeting. As he stepped inside, all eyes turned to him. Some people looked at him with curiosity, others with lingering hostility. But he didn't care. He was no longer the underdog in this story. At the front of the room, Eleanor Brooks stood at the podium trying to project confidence, but James could see the tension in her eyes. When the discussion turned to the road project, James stood up, walked to the front, and placed a stack of documents on the table. The city government has officially offered to purchase the land use rights for the road the HOA built illegally, he announced, his voice calm but commanding. I have accepted their offer. The room fell silent. Eleanor's mouth opened as if to protest, but James raised a hand, stopping her. That means this road will never belong to the HOA, he continued. It will become public property, managed by the city. And, more importantly, the HOA won't receive a single cent. Everything you did only put this neighborhood's property values at risk. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some HOA board members lowered their heads, avoiding Eleanor's gaze. She gripped the edge of the podium tightly, her face drained of color. James scanned the room, feeling the shift in the air. For the first time since this battle began, he knew he had won. James's story is not just a legal battle. It's a testament to the power of perseverance and courage. In life, especially as we grow older, we often encounter injustices where those in positions of power believe they can impose their will on others. But James proved that standing up for your rights is not selfish. It's necessary to preserve dignity and self-worth. The lesson here is simple. Never let others make decisions for you just because they have a louder voice. Whether it's in real estate, finances, or everyday life, know the value of what you own and refuse to bend under social pressure. At the same time, understanding the law and using it to protect yourself is crucial, especially for seniors who are often overlooked in major decisions. In the end, justice favors those who persist and refuse to back down. Through patience and wisdom, James didn't just win. He turned injustice into an opportunity to build something greater.